And joining us now is Adam Tooze, a professor of history at Columbia University and the author of a number of books, including Wages of Destruction, Crashed, How a Decade of Financial Crises Changed the World, and most recently, Shutdown, How COVID Shook the World's Economy. He previously taught at the University of Cambridge as well as Yale, where he was Director of International Security Studies, and he has worked in executive development with major corporations and contributed to the National Intelligence Council and blogs at adamtooze.substack.com, where his latest article is Permanent Crisis or Black Earth Agro-Giant, Alternative Futures for Ukraine. Welcome to Background Briefing, Adam Tooze.
Pleasure to be here.
Well, thanks for joining us. And on Saturday, President Biden and President Putin had a conversation over an hour long, but it sounds like it was the same conversation they've been having for months, where Putin keeps saying you're not addressing our central concerns, and the White House keeps pointing out the grave consequences of sanctions, etc., if Russia were to move militarily against Ukraine. So at this point, U.S. intelligence is suggesting that an attack could take place as early as Wednesday. What do you think the chances are here? You know, on the Russian side, of course, they say the West is being hysterical.
Yeah, I mean, I'm no military expert or intelligence analyst, but the folks who are have been telling us for some time that this is the timeline, right? That it was going to be around the middle of February, that Russia had the military hardware and personnel in place to mount a large-scale offensive. And I guess they're able to judge that on the basis of various, you know, from economist speak, you might say, like, key elements in the military supply chain. Have they got the right bits in the right place to do the sort of things that you would be doing, and to have all the options on the table? And my sense, probably, unless there is extra military intelligence that goes beyond this, is essentially what they're saying is that by the middle of next week, they think the hospitals, the large ammo dumps, the right personnel will be in the right place for them to be able to have all the options. I mean, Russia has the kind of military resources that means it could strike Ukraine in lots of different ways on any given day of the week. But to have all of, as it were, the capacities in place to have the full range of options between selective strikes and full-scale invasion, I think that's what they're really saying, and that will be completed by the middle of next week. They've been saying that for weeks now. And what's really striking is that the Americans are doing this very publicly, right? So there are ways and ways of handling a crisis like this, and the Biden administration seems to be gambling that, as it were, outing the escalation on the Russian side, putting it on the, you know, in the headlines of every single newspaper in the world every single day, is the way of really forcing the Russian hand. That seems to be these are the tactics, I guess, on the American side.
But as we speak, Adam Tooze, Ukraine is surrounded on three sides by massive Russian military forces, and there's an exercise in the north with Belarus, and apparently the highway straight down to Kyiv is pretty much open, and on the Black Sea they've just deployed 6 amphibious assault ships. So if you were in Ukraine, even though Zelensky is telling everybody to be calm, you surely have got to be concerned, right? I mean, why? This doesn't normally happen, does it? A country surrounds a neighbor with massive military force.
Well, this is the second time in 12 months, right? So there was a similar build-up, I mean, not to the same degree as we're seeing now, but it's taken weeks to get to this current pitch. But if you'd asked this question back in early January, you would have said that we're, you know, this is round two, because the first build-up came in the spring of last year. And so, no, I mean, this is extraordinarily ominous. There's no question. I mean, by all accounts, and from everything one can see, large parts of Ukrainian society is simply carrying on as per normal. I mean, you see a lot of engaged folks, journalists, politically active people. There are clearly patriotic demonstrations in the streets, as you might imagine. How far this affects the broader Ukrainian society, it's difficult to judge from the outside. And I'm absolutely no specialist in Ukrainian politics or Ukrainian society. But I mean, it's terrifying enough for us. So one can only imagine how nervous this must make people feel.
And of course, casualties would be massive, civilian casualties. And
that's the thing to reckon with, yeah. I mean, like, because there's quite a lot of loose talk about, patriotic resistance and insurgency and so on. But I think we should be clear about what that implies, which is a Syrian scenario. And that, after all, is a battlefield in which the Russians have ample experience. I mean, their air force in particular every single squadron has had experience in Syria. They know what modern large-scale urban warfare looks like, and it's absolutely horrific. So,
with most of the casualties civilians.
Absolutely, with huge civilian casualties and total disruption of ordinary life, and just ghastly levels of horror.
And again, I'm speaking with Adam Tooze, a professor of history at Columbia University and the author of a number of books, including Wages of Destruction, Crashed: How a Decade of Financial Crises Changed the World, and most recently, Shutdown: How COVID Shook the World's Economy. He previously taught at the University of Cambridge as well as Yale, where he was Director of International Security Studies, and he's worked in executive development with several major corporations and contributed to the National Intelligence Council and blogged at adamtooze.substack.com, where his latest article is Permanent Crises or Black Earth Agro-Giant Alternative Futures for Ukraine. So I want to talk to you about Ukraine's Black Earth, its agricultural riches, but just to finish up on the possible scenarios here, it seems to be there's sort of three possible scenarios: that Putin will continue to destabilize Ukraine and do what they call the salami tactic of slicing and nibbling off pieces of Ukraine to diminish its sovereignty, and he could try and destroy its sovereignty outright with an attack on Kiev and an occupation and put in a puppet government, or he could somehow get the West to agree on the Minsk II agreement, which of course is political suicide for the Ukrainian government. So those are the alternatives. Do you see any other alternative there?
Well, I think a sort of supplement to your option one, which is that they don't engage in any overt aggression or attempt to slice off any further territory, as you put it, but just simply maintain the pressure. Because from Russia's point of view, this is more easy to sustain than it is from the point of view of Ukraine. I mean, arguably, it's more easy for the Russians to sustain than it is for us, for Europe and for the United States. Certainly in terms of the political cycle in Russia, Putin has more options than President Biden does. And Europe is painfully exposed to, its need for gas imports from Russia. So I think that's another scenario. I continue to think it's the most likely one, which is that the Russians go on saying that there's nothing unusual happening here other than that they're deploying their military forces they're entirely entitled to do with their allies and on their own sovereign territory. And the fact that it scares Jesus out of the rest of us is our problem, and points to a series of unresolved issues which we are refusing to address and they will continue to ask to have addressed. And that kind of, they will remain in this position of tension, which is easier for them to maintain than for us, I would submit. So I think the other options, just a plain, a pullback on the Russian side is difficult to imagine. They would have to do that very slowly, I think, to avoid the impression of a defeat. And I do think that an outright invasion, full-scale occupation, and an effort to install a more amenable regime. I think the Russians are fully realistic enough to know that they would be governing not against the totality of Ukrainian polity, but against a large part and a solid majority, I think, of it at this point. And I don't think they can possibly have any interest in that. Maybe some sort of invasion of the type they did in Georgia in 2008, where it's kind of punitive and you march to within, eyesight, if you like, of the country's capital and then pull back again. One could imagine that. But I think all of those are very high stakes options. And I continue to think that from Moscow's point of view, the best option is this sort of siege, essentially.
Well, in terms of Ukraine's economy, it's pretty precarious, is it not? You point out in your article that Ukraine's economic performance between 1990 and 2017 was not just worse than its European neighbors, it was the fifth worst in the entire world. And among the four countries that delivered less growth for their citizens than Ukraine were the Democratic Republic of Congo, Burundi, and Yemen. So that's extraordinary to have a European country in those categories. So the oligarch who supported Zelensky who was elected with 70% of the vote, largely because he promised to get peace with Russia, which has not happened. Now his fortunes are way down to about 30%, although I believe the Ukrainian people are sticking with him because he's the only leader they have in this crisis situation. But he's tied in with an oligarch who took down a big bank that he owned and stole $5 billion. So that is also a problem, is it not? Endemic corruption, and that, of course, would lead to a lack of foreign investment.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, one should say, I went digging for this data because I did a sort of surface cut of this question some weeks ago now and came up with these World Bank data on growth rates and was so shocked by them that I began to worry that I was, unwittingly replicating some, anti-Ukrainian propaganda and dug deeper and unearthed this even more, the data that you're just mentioning, which is truly staggering. Yes, fifth worst growth rate in the world over the period since between 1990 and 2017. Folks will ask, well, is that to do with the shock of Russia's intervention in 2015? It probably, that certainly didn't help, but that doesn't explain the stagnation through to 2015. So if you slice those data slightly differently to exclude the period of open Russian aggression, it wouldn't change the story. It's worth adding that. The crucial point to make, of course, is that Ukraine is not subsisting at the levels of GDP that Burundi or Yemen or the Democratic Republic of Congo are. It subsists at a level which is, as far as we can guess, and these are very complicated, somewhat artificial statistical constructs, but for what they're worth, it seems to subsist at a level of GDP per capita 20% below the late Soviet period. So speaking to Ukrainian sociologists, they will say, in a sense, their country has been in a perpetual crisis since the Brezhnev era of the 1970s and really has not moved out of that space in half a century, which I think then explains everything else in a sense, right? Because on the one hand, with the end of communism, what then is unleashed is this free-for-all, get rich quick, get very, very rich quite quickly, kind of oligarchic, highly corrupt political economy, which we saw in many of the post-Soviet states. And then, as you say, a stagnation, despite the considerable, both human resources. All of the post-Soviet states boast populations with remarkably high levels of education, great talent pool, basically, in, say, the IT sector. And then in the Ukraine's case, assets, heavy industrial assets from the Soviet period, which are not worthless. And then finally, of course, the natural endowment of Ukraine, which has just stupendous agricultural potential, always has. And that, I think, makes the failure of the last 20 years so extraordinary. So on the one hand, it subsists at a level much higher than Democratic Republic of Congo. But of course, it also has advantages that should enable it to grow at least like a Poland or like Russia. And it's very difficult to see how any politician maintains legitimacy in a country which fails at that elementary level.
And well, the article points out that Ukraine is home to a quarter of the fertile black earth soil on this planet. So there's a massive potential there, is there not?
Absolutely. This is this legendary humus, basically. It's the result of the most rich bedding down of organic plant matter, and it should make that entire region into one of the granaries of the world. And in fairness, Ukraine is one of the largest suppliers of grain and agro-industrial products to global markets. It's the one area of the world economy where it really does play a significant part. And were war to break out and trade to be totally disrupted, it would have a very considerable impact on grain markets. And some of the most vulnerable buyers of grain, Lebanon, for instance, is extremely heavily dependent on grain shipments from Ukraine. And if there's a country in the world which doesn't need an additional shock, it's Lebanon. So yes, Ukraine has huge potential. One of the problems is that the land was, when they privatized it, they were worried for obvious reasons about rampaging robber baron capitalists seizing control of this land, Russian and others. And so one of the things they did when they introduced full-scale privatization in 2001 is they made the land, you can't buy and you can't sell it. And as a result, you can't mortgage it either. So the land was the big capital rich businesses have gone in and leased huge tracts of land. on long-term leases. But there hasn't been a private land market, which is often considered by development economists as a key element to a certain sort of, capitalist, small-scale capitalist, small-scale peasant farmer model of economic development.
And one of the provisions of that land reform, and I think land reform just passed in the Rada, Ukrainians are, 80% are opposed to foreign ownership of their land.
Absolutely. So this is, the big story about the Zelensky government, which has been sort of buried by all of the dramas, which is that very much at the insistence of the World Bank and the IMF, which made it a condition of their latest support package for Ukraine, that the Ukrainian parliament, with his big majority, bit the bullet and actually introduced a land reform law, which came into effect on the 1st of July last year, which does make packages up to 100 hectares so far saleable and therefore also available for mortgaging. And then even more remarkably, later that fall, in the fall of 2021, they actually passed an agricultural credit law, which is like one of these first loss backstop facilities where the Ukrainian government puts up a fund and essentially promises to indemnify banks against losses they incur if they lend to small farmers, enabling therefore private credit to provide finance. So that they've actually done all of this. It was quite controversial. The usual suspects were opposed. But one of the key issues in that, absolutely, is that the land was not made available for purchase by foreign investors. And Zelensky originally wanted to push that through. No doubt the IMF and the World Bank favour it. And their modelling suggests you'd get even bigger growth effects if the land was available for foreign purchase. Surprise, surprise. But the Ukrainian parliament wasn't wearing that. So Zelensky promised a referendum on this issue. And according to opinion polling done by local sociological institutes, 80% of Ukrainians would oppose. So that's not happening. So it's going to remain a national land market. But we'll see. I mean, if we can get through this crisis, that's one of the tragedies, right, of the current moment, is that, we're obsessing about tanks and drones and multiple rocket launchers and, the ghastly weapons of destruction, rather than thinking constructively about how Ukraine might be put on a more stable footing. But all of this is interlinked because the fundamental reason why Ukraine is never really going to be a serious candidate for membership in either the EU or NATO, not in the medium term, a matter of decades, is its underdevelopment. I mean, it's the failure of its political economy, the poverty, the corruption, the dysfunction that results from that means that on the one hand, its governments lurch back and forth between Moscow and the West, looking for advantage, looking for an edge, looking for something that will allow them to pull themselves out of this quagmire. And on the other hand, those fantasies, those promises which are made to the Ukrainian public are completely unrealistic. So there's a real tragic element to this situation.
And as you point out, the war that began in 2013, 2014, that's continued with 14,000 Ukrainian casualties, was not about NATO, but a rivalry between the EU and Russia. And that continues, right?
Yes, I mean, it's, in fairness, one should say that from Russia's point of view, the EU and NATO are the same thing. And from the point of view of many of the Baltic states, Poland, the Scandinavians, who also have moved towards EU membership as part of an alignment with the West, they're also the same thing. And historically speaking, the EU, emerged in the Cold War period very much as part of the socio-economic glacis, if you like, of NATO in the Cold War. But specifically in 2013, yes, the issue between Russia and the West was the offer by Brussels or rather the insistence on Ukraine in desperately trying to apply for a grade of not full membership or even, being on the membership track, but a kind of association agreement with the EU that would have given Ukraine various types of advantages for trade and for investment. But what happened is that, though this was sold to the Ukrainian population by the then president as it were, the panacea for Ukraine's problems, when you do a deal with the EU, as say the Brits have discovered over Brexit or the Greeks discovered during the Eurozone financial crisis, they are an incredibly tough bargaining partner. They're very demanding. So every deal comes with a long list of conditionality, and they're really skinflint when it comes to money. So there was, in fact, no money on the table, no significant amount of money on the table. I mean, the oligarchs that run Ukraine were like indignant that their personal fortunes were larger than the kind of money that the EU is putting on the table in this bargain. And Putin knows the scene. and came along with a much more generous offer and bounced the Ukrainian government into accepting that instead, because they were caught between a rock and a hard place. And that's what's unleashed then the Maidan protests and so on, opening the door to the collapse of the regime and the Russia's intervention in 2014 to rescue what it could from the situation. So absolutely, it was a struggle over socio-economic issues in 2013, in which the EU was the principal partner, not NATO, that opened the current phase. From Russia's point of view, of course, the timeline looks different. I mean, the two data points for them are 2008, when at the Bucharest meeting of NATO, the Bush administration bounced the other NATO members into offering, indeed they wrote it in so many words, Ukraine and Georgia will join NATO. And Russia responded to that by choosing the first possible opportunity to deliver a very harsh lesson to the Georgians. And before that, the key moment from the Russian point of view is the intervention of NATO in the former Yugoslavia in the late 1990s, without proper legal backing, without proper UN backing, and that really taught Moscow the lesson that the rules of international law apply to the weak, whereas the strong, powerful members of NATO pick and choose when they will respect the sovereignty provisions that you might think that UN Charter guarantees.
Well, Adam Tooze, I thank you so much for joining us here today.
It's a pleasure.
And again, I've been speaking with Adam Tooze, a professor of history at Columbia University and the author of a number of books, including Wages of Destruction, Crashed, How a Decade of Financial Crises Changed the World, and most recently, Shutdown, How COVID Shook the World Economy. He previously taught at the University of Cambridge as well as at Yale, where he was the director of the International Security Studies, and he has contributed to the National Intelligence Council and blogs at adamtooze.substack.com, where his latest article is Permanent Crisis or Black Earth Agro-Giant, Alternative Futures for Ukraine. We're going to take a brief station break and back looking into the deal the Biden administration is offering the 23 million starving Afghans whose national currency reserves of $7 billion held in New York are to be split in half between paying the families of the victims of 9/11 and setting up a trust fund to somehow get humanitarian aid to Afghanistan without dealing with the